the terminology used in enforcement circles is that things like secure communities and 287G are force multipliers for ICE that basically use local and state law enforcement to do via as proxies what ICE cannot do itself. But it's a vicious cycle because the immigration enforcement also serves as a force multiplier for the mass incarceration system. So undoing both, I think that's a very powerful argument that your report makes.
Absolutely. That's not the only recommendation that deals with this problem of the increasingly intertwined nature of, federal enforcement and state and local enforcement. We have, since 9/11, moved increasingly in the direction of breaking down silos that used to exist, separating state and local law enforcement from federal agencies. And that is dangerous. That is not a good thing. The reason why this has happened is that folks, probably really sneakily intelligent people in the so-called intelligence community at the federal level, made sure, I guess, that the 9/11 Commission report included the finding that, for example, one of the problems that led to 9/11 was a failure to, quote, connect the dots. Well, I just want to make it very clear. That's factually bullshit. That is not true. That is not one of the failures that led to 9/11. In fact, the FBI gave the CIA a bunch of very detailed information about the hijackers and said, we're concerned about these people. And the CIA just fucking ignored it. So, the idea that, integrating state and local law enforcement into the national intelligence architecture and, having programs like See Something, Say Something, where everybody wants to call the cops every time they see a Muslim on public transit is just absurd. None of that is actually true. It did, a failure to connect the dots in the sense that state and local law enforcement could have seen or done something differently it's not what happened. It's a blatant misrepresentation of the actual law enforcement fuck-ups and intelligence fuck-ups that led to 9/11. But nonetheless, that has become the myth that we tell ourselves about what happened in the in the lead up to the 9/11 attacks. And so that's what you see, folks in Congress, that's what you see people in DHS and the FBI and even the CIA and the NSA talking about. And it's certainly what you see at the state and local level when these state and local law enforcement officials who have been given literally billions of dollars by Department of Homeland Security and DOJ grant programs in the name of counterterrorism over the past, well, I've been doing this for a long time, 17 years now. They justify all of that stuff and many of the other things that I talk about in the report. Not, when we see local law enforcement through ICE's eyes as a force multiplier, it's not just in the immigration context either. Local law enforcement and state law enforcement are a force multiplier for the FBI as well. Collecting huge quantities of information about millions and millions of people all over the country through technologies like license plate readers and surveillance cameras, and increasingly will be things like facial recognition systems and other forms of, AI-driven analytics. So if we want to avoid living in a truly dystopian society where I think what we're seeing right now is scary, scary, scary shit happening to immigrants, like, a mother walking with her daughter and then all of a sudden some CBP van rolls up and literally kidnaps the mom out, and takes her away in the middle of, a public street in broad daylight. That type of shit is happening to immigrants now. It is very, very easy to imagine a world in which we live under someone even scarier than Donald Trump, making use of this newly integrated federal, state, local intelligence law enforcement architecture to do similar things to activists, in 20 years who are citizens. So I really just can't emphasize enough how inaccurate the characterization of what led to 9/11 was, that it was a failure to connect the dots. But nonetheless, despite how mythical that framing is, it is exactly what is driving all of this really dangerous stuff at the state and local level. And I should say, too, that there's almost no oversight of that type of stuff. And there are pockets in the country, like in Seattle and San Francisco, there's some degree of oversight over these so-called fusion centers that were established after 9/11. But, one question that folks like Ed Snowden have asked is, to what degree are these fusion centers spots where information that may be obtained pursuant to so-called national security authorities by the NSA through dragnet surveillance operations, to what extent is that information effectively being laundered for the purposes of state and local government law enforcement use at these fusion centers? We really don't have answers to those types of questions, but I think they're really important questions. And
because through parallel construction, local law enforcement can come up with a different rationale and never mention that they got the initial underlying intelligence from the NSA.
Yeah, exactly. So, I guess you could sort of, I think in a way the publication of this report is kind of opportunistic on our part because we have long wanted these things, right? I mean, the steps that we are laying out for progressive communities to take to divorce themselves from the federal government, to sort of build a wall, as we like to say, between our communities and the federal enforcement agencies, those are not new goals. Everything in here is stuff that we've wanted to do for quite some time, but under an administration like President Barack Obama, you're not going to find a lot of sympathy for arguments in Democratic, in these big blue cities for saying, the FBI is a really dangerous organization. We should probably remove our law enforcement officials from their task force operations and do whatever we can, frankly, to wall off information about people in our communities from those agencies. You're going to be looked at like a crazy person, frankly. But now,
because there's a constitutional law. There was a constitutional law scholar in charge of ultimately in charge of the FBI. What's there to worry about?
That's right. And now, of course, we see, thanks to reporting from The Intercept, that in 2014, the FBI's surveillance of Black Lives Matter was much more extensive than we had previously understood. It was not just about social media surveillance. It involved confidential human informants. It involved, infiltration and actually physical surveillance of activists, following them around the streets, keeping track of what they were doing, and obviously a lot more that wasn't redacted in these documents that were finally released. But yeah, so in a sense, what we're doing now is opportunistic to say, we have long warned you people about what is happening in this country. And for 8 years, nobody really cared because the very attractive, beautifully spoken constitutional law professor, first Black president, was in charge. And so everybody thought everything was copacetic. Principles actually matter. Procedures actually matter. Things like establishing and solidifying secure communities, that actually really matters. What's going on at the fusion centers really matters from a policy perspective. And it matters because, A, bad things happen when people you like are in charge, but B, somebody like fucking Donald Trump might take the reins of all this shit. And then what?
And even if Obama had been a civil libertarian, which obviously he was not, once a president, still just president for 4 to 8 years, and you need to design checks on repressive state institutions with the worst president in mind, not the best one.